Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
In one sudden blow, the U.S. crippled Venezuela's cartels with a strike so fierce it shook Maduro on national television. Yet whispers suggest cartels weren't the only target. Washington may want something deeper, more lucrative, and far harder to admit, and it has nothing to do with drugs. The explosions that changed everything. This isn't speculation. This isn't a rumor. The footage you're about to see, the testimony you're about to hear, and the reactions pouring out of Caracas all tell the same story. America's war machine has officially gone beyond its borders in a way the White House has never admitted before. And the fallout. It threatens to ignite the largest diplomatic firestorm in the Western Hemisphere since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The drug cartels are waging war in America, and it's now time for America to wage war on the cartels.
But before we dive into President Maduro's furious televised response, before we unpack the intelligence leaks, the Pentagon denials, and the eyewitness accounts from Venezuelan border towns, I need you to understand something. What the United States just did in Venezuela is being described, even by allies, as nothing short of an extrajudicial bombing campaign. And yet there are those in Washington celebrating it as a victory, as the moment cartels finally paid the price. Whether you see this as justice or as an illegal act of war will depend on what you believe about America's role in Latin America. But one thing is certain, the world will never look at the U.S.-Venezuela relationship the same way again. Let's start with the smoking gun. According to intercepted communications leaked to regional journalists, U.S. Special Operations units conducted a multi-night blitz of cartel infrastructure across Venezuela's interior, targeting not only cocaine processing facilities, but also clandestine airstrips and heavily fortified compounds. Venezuelan state television, usually tightly controlled by Maduro's government, was forced to acknowledge unexplained explosions in the states of Apure, Zulia, and Bolivar. Maduro himself appeared on screen hours later, visibly shaken, declaring,
Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
Now here's where it gets unbelievable. U.S. officials haven't just refused to deny involvement. In fact, one anonymous defense official flat out told reporters that Washington had taken the gloves off in a bid to cripple cartel logistics once and for all. Imagine that. After decades of half-hearted counter-narcotics operations, surveillance, and diplomatic finger-pointing, the U.S. suddenly decides to launch a lightning strike that even Colombian generals privately admit they wouldn't dare attempt.
The U.S. has slowly been building up a large military presence in the Caribbean near Venezuela. A source familiar told Scripps News that the move is part of President Donald Trump's effort to combat those threats from Latin American drug cartels.
And yet, instead of clarity, we're left with a fog of contradictions. On one hand, American media outlets are running headlines that describe the strikes as a precision operation designed to dismantle cartel leadership. On the other hand, Venezuelan state outlets are showing footage of burned-out civilian homes, claiming families were caught in the crossfire. Whose version of events is true? Was this really a surgical takedown of criminal empires, or is it the beginning of a reckless new era of extraterritorial American violence? We'll get to the evidence. We'll show you the satellite images. We'll show you the cartel videos boasting about surviving the attack. But before that, you need to understand why Venezuela and why now. For years, the U.S. government has accused Maduro's regime of harboring and profiting from cartel activity. Reports from the Treasury Department and DEA have described high-ranking Venezuelan officials, including military generals and even Maduro's inner circle, as complicit in drug trafficking routes that funnel narcotics through Central America and into the U.S. In fact, just recently, Maduro himself was indicted by the U.S. Justice Department, and a bounty was placed for his arrest on narco-terrorism charges, with prosecutors claiming he worked with Colombian guerrillas to flood the United States with cocaine. That's not speculation. That's on the record.
Today, the Department of Justice and State Department are announcing a historic $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Nicolas Maduro. To date, the DEA has seized 30 tons of cocaine linked to Maduro and his associates, with nearly 7 tons linked to Maduro himself.
So when explosions rip across the Venezuelan countryside, when cartel warehouses go up in flames, when billions of dollars in drugs are suddenly vaporized, the symbolism is crystal clear. Washington is not just targeting cartels. Washington is targeting the state that shelters them. And this is why Maduro is absolutely livid. His televised rant wasn't just the bluster of a leader under pressure. It was the voice of a man who knows that these strikes are more than just bombs. They are a political message, written in fire and steel, telling the world that the U.S. doesn't care about Venezuelan sovereignty anymore. His words, broadcast to millions of citizens and allies, boiled down to one furious accusation: that America had committed an armed invasion, masked as counter-narcotics. Think about that. Maduro, the same man accused of starving his own people while enriching his cronies, is now trying to paint himself as the victim of imperial aggression. And tragically, for much of the international community, community, the message might stick. Already, leaders in Mexico and Brazil are calling for emergency summits. The United Nations has been flooded with demands for an investigation. And within Venezuela itself, Maduro's propaganda machine is spinning the strikes as proof that the empire will stop at nothing to destroy the Bolivarian revolution. But here's the twist, and it's the detail we'll unravel fully later in this episode. The cartels weren't expecting the strikes either. Yes, you heard that right. According to eyewitnesses, cartel commanders in Venezuela were caught completely off guard, with some reportedly fleeing into Colombia within hours of the first explosions. In other words, this wasn't a staged show. It wasn't a political stunt. It was a real operation with real consequences. The cartels themselves have now declared a relentless drug war on the United States.
Según él, buscar lo mejor para los suyos. Pero el detalle es que ya están los consumidores, ¿no? Si no hubiera consumidores, pues uno le paraba.
And if you think the violence of the last decade was bad, you haven't seen anything yet. This is where the stakes go from dramatic to terrifying. Because if Washington really has ignited an open conflict with cartels inside Venezuela, we're not just talking about one rogue country anymore. We're talking about a transnational criminal empire that spans from the jungles of the Orinoco all the way to safe houses in Miami, Madrid, and Mexico City. We're talking about a hydra that cannot be bombed out of existence, no matter how many compounds go up in smoke. And that, right there, is the heart of the hypocrisy. For decades, U.S. officials have lectured the world about upholding international law. They've condemned other nations for conducting extraterritorial assassinations, for ignoring sovereignty, for waging undeclared wars. And yet here we are, watching American warplanes and drones flatten cartel assets inside a foreign country, without congressional authorization, without international support, and without the faintest plan for what comes next. So ask yourself this: is this justice or is it chaos? Is it a bold strike against organized crime, or is it a reckless gamble that could drag an entire continent into instability? Because by the time we're done, by the time you see the documents, the clips, the raw fury spilling out of Caracas, you may come to the same conclusion we have, that this isn't just another counter-narcotics mission. This is the opening shot in a new kind of war. And make no mistake, the most shocking part is still to come. The cartels strike back, and Washington's dirty secret. If the first of this story shocked you, what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about America's war on drugs. Because while the Venezuelan government is screaming terrorism and the U.S. is bragging about precision strikes, the cartels themselves have just sent their reply. And let me tell you, it is nothing short of terrifying. According to intercepted communications picked up by Colombian intelligence and leaked to independent journalists, senior figures of the so-called Cartel de los Sol, a network of Venezuelan military officers and narco-traffickers, have declared that the United States has now become a legitimate target. That's right, not just U.S. assets in Latin America, not just DEA offices or diplomats, but the United States itself. And while that sounds like cartel bravado, analysts point out that these networks already stretch into Florida, Texas, and California, where sleeper operatives and laundering cells could easily be activated. Let's pause on that for a moment. For decades, Americans have been told the cartels are south of the border, that their violence stays contained in Mexico or Colombia. But if the cartel videos circulating on encrypted apps are real, then their vow is clear. They want to bring the war to Washington. And the first evidence of that came just hours after the Venezuelan strikes. A convoy of heavily armed men ambushed a Venezuelan military outpost near the Colombian border, killing 17 soldiers in what local commanders called the worst attack in years. Caracas immediately blamed US-backed mercenaries, but Colombian officials quietly told reporters that this wasn't a mercenary raid at all. It was retaliation by cartel fighters furious over losing billions in drugs overnight. In other words, the US may have ignited a war that Venezuela itself cannot control. And that's where the story begins to unravel. Because leaked Pentagon documents, yes, documents that have surfaced online, suggest that Washington knew this operation would provoke blowback, and they greenlit it anyway. One section of the report describes the strategy as a calculated risk designed to destabilize cartel-state cooperation, regardless of collateral political fallout. In other words, the chaos we're seeing now was anticipated. Think about the implications of that. If these leaks are real, and multiple outlets are now confirming their authenticity, then the US wasn't blindsided by Maduro's rage or the cartel threats. It wanted this instability. Why? Analysts point to two possible motives. First, domestic politics. The Trump administration, already on a war against the border crisis and fentanyl deaths, desperately needs a win on drugs. What better way to show strength than to literally bomb the cartels in their stronghold?
Latin America's got a lot of cartels. They've got a lot of drugs flowing, so we want to protect our country. We have to protect our country. We haven't been doing it for 4 years, and we love this country like they love their countries. We have to protect our country. So, we're playing a tough game.
Second, geopolitics. Venezuela isn't just a drug state, it's also sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. By destabilizing Maduro now, the U.S. could be setting the stage for a post-Maduro government more friendly to Washington's energy needs. But here's where the hypocrisy becomes unbearable. Remember all the lectures U.S. leaders gave about Russia bombing targets in Ukraine? Remember the outrage when Turkey launched strikes against Kurdish militants across the Syrian border? Washington said those were illegal, destabilizing, reckless. And now, the U.S. has done the exact same thing in Venezuela. This is why the international response is spiraling. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, called the U.S. action a violation of sovereignty and demanded an emergency regional summit. Brazil has echoed that call, warning that if Washington can bomb Venezuela in the name of counter-narcotics, it could one day justify similar actions elsewhere in Latin America. Meanwhile, Russia and China are seizing the opportunity, blasting the U.S. at the United Nations for imperialist aggression. And in Caracas, Maduro is doing exactly what you'd expect. He's turning this crisis into political fuel. On state television, he thundered,
En Venezuela sí hay gobierno digno y aquí estamos de pie. Saca tus manos de aquí, Donald Trump. Saca tus manos cochinas de aquí. Ya basta de intervencionismo imperialista.
Here's the sinister part. For once, Maduro isn't entirely wrong, because while Washington insists the strikes were solely about cartels, Venezuelan opposition figures claimed the bombs hit more than just drug labs. According to opposition sources, at least one of the destroyed sites was an oil storage depot used by the state-owned company PDVSA. Was that intentional? If so, then this wasn't just counter-narcotics. It was a shot at Venezuela's economic lifeline. The U.S. denies this, of course. Pentagon spokespeople say every target was cartel-linked infrastructure, but the problem is credibility. Washington has lost so much trust internationally that even its allies are questioning the narrative. European diplomats have asked for independent verification of the strike sites, and without proof, Maduro's claim of terrorism begins to sound more plausible to millions of Venezuelans who already view America as the enemy. But let's zoom out, because the story isn't just about bombs and speeches. It's about what happens next, and that's where the real danger lies. Cartels have money, weapons, and manpower, but above all, they have reach. Already, U.S. border patrols are reporting chatter about increased smuggling attempts, potentially coordinated as a response to the strikes. Imagine if cartels deliberately flood fentanyl into U.S. cities as revenge. Imagine if assassinations of American officials in Mexico or Colombia begin popping up. That's not paranoia. Analysts say it's a real possibility now that the U.S. has crossed this line. And then there's the regional angle. Colombia, America's closest ally in the region, is now in an impossible position. Its government has worked for years to broker fragile peace deals with armed groups on the border. But now, after the strikes, those groups are emboldened, believing they can rally popular anger against Washington. Colombian officials are quietly panicking that violence will spill over their borders, something they fought decades to contain. Meanwhile, inside the U.S., the political divide is widening. Hawks in Congress are cheering the operation, calling it long overdue justice. Senator Marco Rubio went so far as to say the strikes were the beginning of the end for Maduro's narco state. But others, including members of Trump's own party, are calling it reckless. The American public woke up to find out its military had launched an operation inside a sovereign country. Does that sound familiar? It should. Iraq, Libya, Syria. The pattern is undeniable. Washington acts first, explains later, and in doing so, it keeps dragging the American people into conflicts they never signed up for. Here's the part that should terrify you most. Multiple reports suggest the cartels are now pooling resources. Yes, rival groups cooperating in order to strike back. One Colombian intelligence officer described it as a narco union against the U.S. If that's true, then Washington may have created the very monster it claimed to be fighting, a unified cartel network fueled by rage with billions at its disposal. And yet, despite all this, the American media is largely celebrating. Cable news anchors are praising the strikes as a decisive blow. Editorial boards are running pieces about restoring deterrence. But if you read between the lines, if you look at the leaks and the eyewitness accounts, a different picture emerges. One not of strength, but of hubris. One not of justice, but of chaos. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest, you cannot bomb away a cartel. You cannot airstrike away corruption, poverty, or demand for drugs. And every bomb dropped in Venezuela is another piece of propaganda handed to Maduro. Another reason for cartels to rally their fighters. Another spark in a region already drenched in gasoline. And that's why the next part of this story will be the most important. Because we're not just talking about one dramatic night of explosions. We're talking about the beginning of a regional war. A war that could reach the U.S. border sooner than than anyone realizes. But before we get there, let's ask the question that no one in Washington wants to answer. Who really benefits from this? Who signed off on a strike that risks so much for so little gain? And what are the consequences if, as the leaks suggest, this was never really about drugs at all, but about oil, power, and control? That answer, and the most damning revelations yet, come next. It was never about drugs. The oil war exposed. By now, you've seen how the United States unleashed a wave of strikes across Venezuela. You've seen Maduro's rage, the cartel's terrifying threats, and the region's spiral into instability. But here's the part no one in Washington wants to talk about. The strikes were never just about cartels. That's the story for public consumption. The easy narrative you can sell to Americans exhausted by drugs flowing across the border. The real story, buried in leaks, whispered by diplomats, and hinted at by oil executives, is something far darker. Because the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes. This operation was about oil, about control, about reshaping Venezuela, not saving it.
The United States wants Venezuela's oil, and they're willing to go to war for that oil.
Let's start with a fact. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than anyone. That's not theory, that's geological reality. For years, the US has been locked out of those reserves because of sanctions and Maduro's alignment with Russia, China, and Iran. But in the last 12 months, with global oil markets squeezed, Washington has quietly started signaling it wants Venezuelan oil back in play. Now consider this. One of the alleged strike sites, according to Venezuelan opposition figures, was not a cartel safehouse at all, but a storage depot connected to PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil company. If true, that means the US military wasn't just dismantling drug operations, it was hitting the infrastructure of Venezuela's economic lifeline. Coincidence? Or the first move in a larger strategy to force Maduro into economic collapse? Here's where it gets even more suspicious. Just days before the strikes, ExxonMobil announced fresh interest in expanding drilling in neighboring Guyana, a country locked in a bitter territorial dispute with Venezuela over the oil-rich Essequibo region. That dispute has been heating up for months. What are the odds that Washington's sudden decision to bomb Venezuela's cartels right next to one of the world's hottest new oil frontiers is pure coincidence? Oil executives insist there's no connection, but history tells a different story. Because let's be honest, this isn't the first time the US has blurred the lines between counter-narcotics and regime change. In the 1980s, America justified interventions across Latin America under the banner of fighting drugs, while propping up regimes that served US corporate and strategic interests. The DEA and CIA's dual role in Central America is a documented fact. And now, decades later, it looks like the same playbook is being dusted off, this time in Venezuela. And here's the kicker. Multiple leaks suggest the CIA had advanced knowledge of cartel locations inside Venezuela, information allegedly shared by dissident Venezuelan military officers. In other words, the US may not have acted alone. It may have coordinated with factions inside Maduro's own armed forces, factions eager to weaken him. That's not just counter-narcotics, that's regime destabilization. If true, this means the strikes weren't simply about taking out cartels. They were about driving a wedge into Venezuela's military, creating paranoia and mistrust, and opening the door to eventual regime collapse. And once Maduro is gone, the prize is obvious: oil, contracts, influence.
Esta batalla también la vamos a ganar y Venezuela saldrá adelante, airosa, superando agresiones, bloqueo. No han podido ni podrán jamás con Venezuela.
This is why the stakes are so high. Because if America really is using the cartel threat as cover for regime change, the blowback will be enormous. Not just from Venezuela, not just from cartels, but from every country in the region that remembers the scars of past US interventions. Already, Mexico is warning of a precedent that could destabilize the entire hemisphere. Brazil is furious. Colombia is nervous. Russia and China are circling like vultures, eager to turn Latin America into the next battleground of the global order. And the cartels, they're already adapting. Intelligence reports claim that after losing billions in product, networks are rerouting through Ecuador and Suriname. That means this war is about to expand. You can bomb Venezuela all you want, but the cartels will simply shift. They'll move their labs, their runways, their shipments, and every time the US drops another bomb, the cartels gain a new propaganda victory, proof that America is the bully, the empire, the invader. So where does this leave us? In Washington, there is no consensus. Hawks want escalation, more strikes, more raids, even a naval blockade. Doves warn that the U.S. is already knee-deep in another endless conflict, and the American public, they're split. Some cheer, thinking the government is finally getting tough on drugs. Others see the writing on the wall, another intervention, another war, another drain of lives and resources with no clear endgame. But here's the truth you won't hear on cable news. You cannot bomb away demand. As long as Americans consume narcotics, there will be cartels. As long as cartels exist, there will be corrupt states like Venezuela willing to shelter them. And as long as oil and resources remain in play, U.S. foreign policy will always find a reason to intervene. That's the cycle. That's the pattern. And Venezuela may just be the latest chapter in a story as old as the Monroe Doctrine itself. So when you hear U.S. officials boast about exploding cartel operations, remember what you've seen in this investigation. Yes, compounds burned. Yes, drugs were destroyed. But beneath the smoke lies a deeper agenda, one that has little to do with saving American lives and everything to do with securing American interests. And that's why President Maduro is furious, not just because bombs fell on his country, but because he knows what's coming next. Economic collapse, military defections, maybe even an invasion masked as humanitarian intervention. He knows the strikes are just the beginning, and if history is any guide, he's probably right.
What they're threatening to do against Venezuela, regime change, a military terrorist attack, is immoral, criminal, and illegal.
So ask yourself, was this about justice or conquest? About drugs or oil? About safety or empire? Because the answer may change the way you look at America's role in the world forever. And the scariest part? This war, the war that began with explosions in Venezuela, is far from over. And with that, we've come to the end of this deep dive. For more juicy content like this, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications, and check out the cards showing on your screen for more videos. Don't forget to comment your thoughts below.